Greetings everyone and welcome to my little garden. In today's video, we will be reviewing Digimon Survive, Bandai Namco's unintentionally most highly anticipated release in a very long time. Probably. Between being delayed by the global pandemic as well as having to completely switch development studios, the production of this game was quite troubled, to say the least, and probably garnered the game way more attention than it actually warranted. Regardless of history, the game is here and available for the world to behold. So, is it any good? The short answer is yes, absolutely. But I think we can do a little better than just a short answer. Before we really get into it, I need to do some disclaimers to fully contextualize this review. The review is based on my personal experience with the game, which at the time of writing encompasses my first playthrough and the completion of New Game Plus. More specifically, my first playthrough where my decisions led me to the moral route, and New Game Plus where I completed the truthful route. I'd also like to add that this is in fact my first time playing a visual novel game. I've played games with tremendous amounts of dialogue and text such as Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth and Persona 5, but Digimon Survive is my first genuine visual novel game. Also, I've had very limited experience with tactical RPGs. Literally, the only tactical RPG I've ever fully played was Project Cross Zone, and the gameplay of that is such a deviation from the traditional expressions of the genre. And one last thing, I am not an expert in human psychology, but since fear and trauma are such central themes for this game, I will be talking about it. And with all that out of the way, let's get on with the review. While it's true that I do love this game, I must also acknowledge that this is an experience that isn't for everyone. When the developers told us that this game is 70% visual novel and 30% tactical RPG, they weren't kidding. For better or worse, the main meat of this game is the storytelling, and fortunately, it's an extremely engaging story indeed. Many fans and reviewers alike have compared the premise of the plot to be extremely similar to the Digimon Adventure anime. Our main group of protagonists are on a camping trip where they experience strange weather phenomena, then find themselves transported to a strange new world. The similarities don't end there. Many players find the main characters to be echoes of past Digimon anime protagonists, and I'd have to agree. Where this game starts to deviate from the anime and even other past Digimon game titles is how it presents the main themes, which are decisively much darker and more mature. Much of the plot revolves around survival and the extreme pressure this puts onto our protagonists. And the stakes are exceedingly high. At the very least, it's about life or death, or at most, the fate of two worlds. Speaking of which, let's not forget that this is still a game, and the player must interact with the plot in order to move it forward. There are two main driving forces that determines the course of the game. First is the karma system. At important points throughout the story, players are required to make a choice, of which aligns with different paths: moral, harmony, and wrath. These decisions affect how the main character's partner Digimon, Agumon, will evolve into, and later on, towards the last act of the story, the karma system affects the ending of the game too. The effects of the karma system can be pretty wild, especially if you intend to play the game honestly. On my first playthrough, my choices tended to be harmonious, which resulted in Agumon evolving into Tyrannomon, but as the game progressed, my choices tended to become increasingly moral, which in turn led to the evolution of Metal Greymon and eventually the evolution of War Greymon. In contrast, one of my friends had a spectacularly varied evolutionary route just on their first playthrough, starting from Agumon, who evolved into Tyrannomon, then Metal Greymon, and finally into Machinedramon. The other big driving force of the game is the affinity system. If you've played Persona games before, this is similar to social links or the confidant system. The game will frequently take a break from the main plot, and during these downtimes, the player can interact with the other main characters, aka your friends. You converse with them, and much like the karma system, your conversation will lead you to make a choice which will determine how you will respond to or interact with your friends. Should you choose the right decision, your friend will like you more, and their affinity with you will go up. The most important part of the affinity system is to unlock higher evolved forms of their Digimon partners. Additionally, their affinity determines how often they will be providing support during combat. Speaking of which, let's talk about combat. While this game is very largely a visual novel, it's also a tactical RPG, where players can choose units to place on the map and move them around a grid to fight against enemy units. Your units consist of the main character's partner Digimon and/or Digimon you may have recruited. The straightforward approach is to move your units into advantageous positions to do the most damage as possible against enemies. There's a surprising amount of depth in these battles. Each Digimon possesses unique stats, abilities, range, and resistances that affect the flow of combat. But also, you don't have to fight if you don't want to. Other than mandatory battles that force the story to move forward, you may instead choose to talk to enemy units. Somewhat like the karma and affinity systems, talking to your enemies can potentially yield desirable rewards. This is quite similar to Atlas games where you can recruit enemies instead of defeating them. Should you succeed in getting your enemy to like you, you'll have the chance to either recruit them or you can ask them to give you an item instead, which guarantees you a reward. Depending on the situation, it may be in your best interest to sometimes win over a monster's approval instead of winning through brute force. There's definitely more to what this game is all about, but I think this is a good enough summary. Now I want to talk about the things I enjoyed about this game, and there are indeed many things that I liked. This is my first ever visual novel game, so I wasn't sure how well I would acclimate to the genre. Much to my surprise, it was a lot more comfortable than I anticipated, especially for my first time. It definitely helped that I'm already a huge Digimon fan, so I was already looking forward to the story. Historically speaking, Digimon tends to have strong story presentations, and this game is no different. I found the story to be incredibly engaging, and I was continuously thrilled as it unfolded. The lore is a mix of familiar themes that have been touched on by the franchise, while also introducing new concepts and ideas. For example, the bond between human and monster partners is still a central theme and is an especially familiar concept for fans of Digimon's anime series. However, the very nature of Digimon themselves is, at least to my knowledge, completely unique to this game. For most of the game, Digimon aren't even called Digimon and are instead referred to as Kemonogami, or beast gods. And I'm honestly a huge fan of this concept. And going back to the themes of partnership, the premise of the story really pushes the relationship between humans and their fated partners to the limit. The Digimon partners from the anime tended to be either complementary or supplementary to the human protagonists, and their presence bring the best out of their human companions. Now, this is still all true for Digimon Survive, but then add elements of survival pressures, clashing interests, paranoia, childhood trauma, psychotic delusions, and everyone's favorite, verbal and physical abuse. As both the player and the viewer, it was so fascinating for me to see these kids and their partners face against such trials and tribulations, with some of them succeeding and a few of them failing so miserably, and the ones that fail pay the ultimate price as a consequence. This is such a diverse and well-written cast of characters. I felt such a vast range of emotions when engaging with these kids. Some of them I really rooted for, some of them annoyed me at certain points, and for at least one of them, I had a seething hatred for. But even though I have negative feelings towards certain characters, that's actually a good thing. This means I really cared about the dynamics of the cast. This means I wasn't bored bored by them. This means this game greatly succeeded in making me evoke the emotions that the writing deliberately wanted to draw out. I watch these kids bicker and argue with each other, and during those scenes, I'd get annoyed, but then I'd think about how such wildly different personalities would clash, especially in a situation where it's literally life or death. Do you stay in the safety of your home base, or do you risk exploring the outside world to look for answers? These choices resonate differently with each character, and it's so interesting to see them weigh these options with both their personal interests and the group's collective well-being factored in. But I don't think I'd be as engrossed with the story if it wasn't for the artistic strengths supporting it from every angle. Good lord, this game is so f***ing pretty. As a visual novel, it does have to settle for simple aesthetics. While the animated intro is pretty cool, the game doesn't feature any particularly elaborate animation techniques. But what it does have are generally gorgeous background art and exceptional character illustrations. The art heavily relies on a handful of key poses and facial expressions to convey the character's state of being, but thankfully, Digimon Survive really nails the whole less is more thing. The battle segments get more of the game's dazzle for sure, and the illustrations and the simplified battle animations are super charming. And speaking of which, the tactics gameplay is kind of addicting, not gonna lie. According to some reviews, the tactics segments are pretty basic, and for some it's pretty boring, but I don't share that sentiment. Maybe the tactics system is pretty basic, but that doesn't bother me at all. I really like the gameplay mechanics, and the playable Digimon themselves include a ton of unique qualities, which makes team building a lot of fun. So yeah, I adore this game's art. But art isn't strictly visual, of course. This game has an outstanding soundtrack, and by the gods, the music is so good. I looked into it a bit, and the music was composed by Tomoki Miyoshi. This guy has contributed his talent to just a handful of projects, including a few video games. Those among us who've paid attention to the soundtrack can all probably agree that Miyoshi-san has a very promising future in his musical career, and heaven knows he deserves it. With the artistic direction of this game being so heavily dependent in hand-drawn illustrations, this will end up becoming one of those games that will never age poorly. And that's the greatest advantage of 2D art. It's having that timeless quality that 3D CGI could never really hope to match. Top it off with an ethereal soundtrack, and I can honestly say that Digimon Survive will remain as beautiful and elegant 10 years from now as it was on day one. For all the praises I have sung, it's still not exactly a perfect game. I don't have too many problems with it, but I guess this is the part where I get to be a bit nitpicky. Some of the criticisms pointed at the game's battle mechanics are valid, but let me get this out of the way. If you're one of those people who were disappointed in the tactical RPG segments because the visual novel element heavily outweighed it, then I want to be very clear that I don't agree with you. You probably weren't prepared that a visual novel is a visual novel, and you totally should have expected a much larger volume of dialogue that does, in fact, require you to actually read. That type of criticism sounds more like a you problem, and I'm not gonna sympathize. But like I said, there are some criticisms that I do think are totally fair. One of the big ones that I feel quite strongly about is the pacing of raising your Digimon. Yes, you heard me right, I said pacing. This starts with the issue of how you even evolve your Digimon in the first place, which is through the use of very specific items. At the early parts of the game, it's not very hard to recruit rookie-level Digimon, and that part is pretty exciting at first. But also early on, you'll realize that in order to evolve your rookies, you'd have to use an item called the Mature Enlightenment Slab, which are extremely limited at that point in the game. There is a way to farm a handful of these slabs early in the game, but then again, you'll only get a few extra out of it. So for much of the early game, you'd probably want to attempt to recruit champion level Digimon instead, and that gets a little more frustrating. Even if you have a successful conversation with a Digimon, your chances of being able to recruit Digimon that are champion level or higher will always be less than 40% or even lower, and this is a generous estimate. It gets a bit irritating after a while. I would talk to a Digimon, respond to them correctly every single time, and then they just run away when I ask them to be my friend. Amazingly, farming for slabs that evolve champion level Digimon into ultimates, then slabs that evolve your ultimates into megas are disproportionately much easier to do, so I don't know what's up with that. This all leads to my next issue, which I will admit is more of a personal gripe than a valid criticism. This game doesn't seem to care about raising at all, or if it does, it cares very little. Like in the Persona games, there's actually incentive to raise low-level demons because you can more easily manipulate their stats as they level up. In Digimon Survive, there doesn't seem to be any real point in having your rookies other than to fill up your library. Now, I am grossly oversimplifying that. There are a few evolutionary routes that can only be completed by evolving specific Digimon, some of which can be quite rare encounters, but I do feel that the evolutionary system could have been handled differently, and I guess I'm saying that as a player who's poured over 1,000 hours in the Cyber Sleuth games, where the evolution system is significantly more robust. But the thing is, this issue of mine practically becomes non-existent in New Game Plus. Not just because all of my Digimon get carried over, but also because New Game Plus gives you access to challenging dungeons that absolutely spoiled me with incredible items, including Evo slabs. So yeah, it's a me problem. And finally, my last complaint about this game is the inconsistency of the localization. Spelling errors, grammatical errors, frequent misgendering. When compared to the sheer volume of text this game has, the errors don't actually amount to what can be considered as too much, but it's certainly far from negligible either. These errors are thinly sprinkled throughout the game's length, but I found the greatest number of mistakes in Part 5. And then there's this. This is just inexcusable. Since these errors don't actually appear that frequently and none of them were so impactful that they'd change parts of the plot, this doesn't really bother me, for the most part. What does bother me is that this isn't the first Digimon game to have such errors. Even the more recent titles, like the Cyber Sleuth games, had some translation errors, and the errors for those games were not at all corrected even after they were re-released as a complete edition. Now, this doesn't bode well for future Digimon games. Something that Digimon Survive has in common with the Cyber Sleuth games is that all these games retained the original Japanese audio, with no alternative language audio experience. So, unless you are completely fluent in Japanese, you will have no choice but to read subtitles. And it's not a good look when the subtitles you're heavily relying on to understand these games could be erroneous. In this modern age, I hope that maybe Bandai Namco could release a patch that can correct these errors, but since they could have done that for the Cyber Sleuth games too, but never did, my hopes aren't exactly very high here. If future Digimon games are not to have alternate language audio dubs, then they should at least have clean text localization. This may sound like I'm demanding perfection, which I kind of am, at least for localization, but this is something that most of us, including myself, already take for granted when playing localized versions of Japanese games. So why can't Digimon games also get it right? So, here are my closing thoughts. Digimon Survive is a great game, and I loved my experience with it. And I know that I'm going to continue to enjoy it because I intend to explore this game more thoroughly over time. But in order to get the most out of this game, you really should be accepting it for what it is. And this is a deliberately text-heavy, narrative-focused visual novel game. The tactics RPG element is not the main focus, and it never really was. There are some very harsh reviews out there throughout the internet that accuses Bandai Namco of, quote, tricking players into thinking that this is supposed to be a more traditional JRPG or tactics RPG. But while I can see how some people might get this conclusion by misinterpreting what they saw in the trailers, the game devs themselves told us that this is primarily a visual novel. And even the trailers show a lot of visual novel elements too, so if you didn't pay attention to any of that, then that's really on you, and I don't have any sympathy. But then again, Digimon Survive belongs in a genre that is already hard to recommend to begin with. I think most of us can agree that visual novels doesn't exactly have what most of us would call mass appeal. The Digimon IP was enough for me to try it out, and I'm very happy that I did. While this is not exactly the golden chalice, this is still a solid game that succeeds within its genre, and is especially remarkable for its artistic accomplishments. We have made it to the end of the video. Have you played Digimon Survive? Let me know what you think of this game in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more content. Thank you so much for watching, and train hard, Tamers!